Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We hope to entertain you tonight. We've our very own selection of most excellent writers, but it's best if you see with your own eyes. We sincerely hope, ladies and gentlemen, that for you we'll successfully provide both the best of the best and the worst of the best, but those are logically still quite alright. Well, it's a blast to see the turnout tonight. It's surely more than I hoped for when I wrote this last night. Yes, it's hard to believe this incredible sight, but regardless, there's a minor remark from my side. Please disengage any mobile device, though we won't kill you if you don't heed our advice. I'd not chance it if I were you, 'cause to be honest, we just might.
And with that, we have started the third book launch of Untold Stories history and our I don't know how manyth reading night, probably sixth. Thanks to David for playing this wonderful introductory song, which, as you may have noticed, was written in a different time where we would tell people to turn off their cell phones. Right now, if you are watching this live stream on your cell phone, please don't turn it off because the live stream will not work if you do. Which also does show that David did not, in fact, write this song tonight, which is one of these small lies that writers tell, you know, so there's your theme. First of all, if you are completely new to this, if you just entered a random YouTube address and it took you to this live stream, first of all, congratulations, that's amazing and incredibly unlikely. But second of all, just for that kind of case, I should explain what Untold Stories is. Untold Stories is the official writing group of the English department of the Munich LMU, which stands for Ludwig Maximilians University, if you speak it English, and which nobody ever says in its entirety. It's composed of students and former students of the LMU who love writing in English, and it was founded in 2014 by our wonderful lecturer, Anne Pincus, who is still responsible for the things we do here. I have to say that legally. No, I don't. And generally, the group meets about once a week with different members attending at different frequencies to discuss stories that were posted on our website. We are always happy about new members, anyone who wants to try out their own English writing or just would like to hang out with people who are interested in writing. And there are annual reading events and book launches, such as tonight, where we are introducing our newest and third major publication. Major meaning it has several pages, not it is an international bestseller. It might still be, you know, you can help. For this evening, we are going to have 4 readers who are reading stories and poems from the book. Those are Brianna Goins, Tabea Hawkins, Phoebe Hemsley, and myself. Seen here in perfect partner look, you wouldn't want to guess how much it costs to print all these huge backdrops that we all have behind us. It's definitely how that works. And the writers for the night are quite a few more, because the writers who are in this book are Miriam Balke, Benjamin Bechhofer, Nicole Benker, Alessia Cortina, Brianna Goins, Michael Van Hawk, Tabea Hawkins, yes, you see kind of a bird of prey theme going on there, Ethel Itzkovich, Ridui Zhang, Sophia Klaver, Carla Sökefeld, Amadeus Stadler, Maximilian Stark, that's me, Paul Übler, and Evelyn Ranich, with a preface by Anne Pincus. Also, if you have learned about this reading night via Instagram, then Alessia Cortina is also the person you should thank for all the wonderful social media posts. Now, since this is a book launch, I shouldn't only talk about the group, but also about the book. This is the book we are launching and which is available for a very affordable €7 at Wordsworth English Bookshop, which you can order via the link that's under the video. I will remind you of this at different points during the video because, small secret just between us, we would like to sell you this. Now, this book has a little bit of a gimmick that we figured out because with a title like Impending Past and Foregone Future, you may be able to conclude that this book is about time. And so we have written a book that goes from the very distant past to the very far future. But since we do not believe that time should be seen as this strictly linear, strictly, past to future kind of deal, kind of arrow of time, we just made it so you can read it from either direction. You can start in the future and read towards the past as well, if that strikes your fancy more. You could start on this side of the book and then just read your way from the future towards the past. On the way, you would encounter wonderful illustrations by both Michael van Hock and Evelyn Ranich, and you would eventually arrive in the past. Or you start in the past, like most people would. It's probably the saner option, but also less interesting. So, it's up to you. This book is almost, I would like to say, part of a trilogy. Because if you already own an Untold Stories book, you might have noticed that it kind of, in its cover layout, resembles our first book, Better Than Escaping, which we released in, I want to say, 2016. And our second book, Afraid of Heights, which is currently trying to hide itself because it is the only book in the collection that's only filled with poems and doesn't have short stories in it. And it feels a bit ashamed of that and is therefore trying to make itself invisible. It shouldn't feel ashamed of itself, though, and I will kindly ask it to not be invisible. 1 second. Oh, there we go. That's better. Because it contains some absolutely lovely poetry. Both of these books can also be ordered from Wordsworth English Bookshop. First book, Better Than Escaping, €7. Second book, Afraid of Heights, for €5. And the third book, also for €7. I have asked a math student what that is, what the sum of that is, and that math student has assured me that it would be €19 for all of them together, which I, having myself not studied math, can't really confirm for you. So if you want a nice trilogy, there you go. All of those are available at Wordsworth English Bookshop by just clicking the link in our description. And if you want them sent to you, you will have to give Wordsworth postage. They do not have a secret deal with Santa Claus to get stuff delivered through a chimney. Before we properly begin, which will be very soon, I know I have been rambling on for about 2.5 hours now. We would quickly like to thank the English and American Studies Department, and in particular, Jill Woodman, Renate Schruff, and Wolfgang Faulkner for their support, as well as the Anglumni for their support in making it possible to actually produce this book. For this evening, some of us have suggested to go all night with it, but in the end, sanity prevailed. So we will be having an evening of about 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is divided in 2 halves. There will be a bit of an interlude in the middle in case, you have to go to the toilet, but, it's 1 hour, 15 minutes. We think it's doable. At least we won't fall off our chairs. Music has been by the wonderful David Hoos, who you've already heard playing, who will also be providing music later in this evening. His website should also be in the video description, though I have not checked this personally, and I might be lying through my teeth. Also, our wonderful Amadeus has manned the chat and will be answering any questions you have in that chat room, please do keep him busy. He likes to be busy. I think that is all the information you will be needing, and probably more information than was needed about what we planned for this live stream. And so what should be more appropriate to mark the beginning of an evening than the beginning of the world?
The Beginning of the World by Evelyn Ranich. Rest your weary wings, my love. Your scales are cracked and dim. Dip your head in oceans wide, let water wash away your sins. Rest your weary wings, my dear, you've worked for eons on. Dance and dream in mother's love, a balm on your soul alone. Rest your weary wings, my soul. You have shaped the earth with blood, dragged your coils along what's dear, breathing life into us all. That was the first poem, and indeed there's a lot more words to come later this evening. And next up is a few words in particular, these words read by Tabia.
This is the first poem by Nicole Banker that we're going to be reading this evening. These words. Do you know how hard it is for me not to say these words, even though they are branded in my mind like a family crest on oxidized silver? Do you know how hard I have tried not to say these words, even though they linger on my tongue like red vine stains on beige carpets? Do you know how hard I have fought not to say these words, even though they leave marks on my skin like scars from small wounds that would have healed just fine if I'd not scratched them open and not picked at the scabs? Moving on from poetry, we have our first short story of the evening.
Thank you. This next piece is an excerpt from Pears, 1941 by Carla Sokefeld. We will travel back in time to World War II through the eyes of the author's grandmother when she was a child. So this is Pears, 1941. Wake, trek, west, west, rest. The room they locked themselves in had a narrow window. Elsa peered out of it at the trees with their empty branches, the farm scattered across the pastures like dice on a playboard. The room also had a fireplace, but there was no wood. It was a pity, but not as much of a disappointment as Elsa would have thought. Throughout the last week, she had all but forgotten what warmth felt like anyway. They had arrived in Stettin the day before yesterday and been refused entry to the city. There had been nothing they could do but turn back and retrace the 15 or so kilometers they had traveled in the morning. Hedwig claimed she could make out her footsteps from a few hours before, but it had snowed since then, and Elsa told her so, almost making her cry. She felt cruel and righteous at the same time. This was war. There was no time for fancy. At dusk, they had arrived again in the small village with the castle. The farms looked familiar, like the one they had left a month ago and hundreds of kilometers east, but none of the villagers wanted to let them into their homes, flea-ridden, hungry, dirty refugees that they were. Elsa had heard the farmer say this to her mother in those exact words. But they could camp in the castle, he had added. It had been abandoned years ago, and her mother had thanked him for her kindness. Elsa had wanted to spit at him, but instead she kept her mouth shut in a smile. A lot of the rooms had been locked, but they had found one which was open, and it had a key stuck in the lock from the inside, unturned. It was at the end of a narrow hallway and completely empty, apart from a pair of brown leather shoes standing orphaned in its center. They had all taken turns trying them on, and they had fit Elsa the best, so she had exchanged them with her old ones, which were starting to come open at the seams from all the walking they'd been forced to endure. At first, Elsa wondered who her new shoes had belonged to and why they had left them here. But when she got an idea for a possible reason, she shrunk back from it and tried not to think about it anymore. They had stayed inside the room the last 2 days and only gone outside to relieve themselves and to collect snow to melt water in one of their pots. 2 of her sisters had already caught colds. Rose was the only one not sniffling. Through the window, Elsa could see a column of soldiers coming towards the castle. It was shorter than she had expected. She tried to count their heads, but they were hard to make out. She guessed there were about 20 of them. The winter hadn't decimated only their own numbers. The cold didn't discriminate between nationalities. The soldiers' black silhouettes looked like commas against the muddy snow. Elsa knew what would come next. That's why they locked the door. Rose appeared next to her, breathing warmly into her neck. "The soldiers," she said, and their mother, who had been talking quietly to their grandmother, froze, then hissed at them to come down from the window at once. They obeyed and sat down next to their sisters. Hedwig, Edith, Rose, herself, her mother with her unborn fifth sister in her belly, her grandmother. It had become a habit for Elsa to count the members of her family whenever they sat down to rest, looking at each to make sure they were still there, willing them to stay. It wasn't in her power to keep them safe, but she could always wish and pray and hope, and she did every day. Reflexively, Elsa put her arms around her sisters, Rose on her left side, the two younger ones on the right. Her mother saw, smiled a weary smile at her, and reached out to stroke her hair. It was one smooth motion, over so quickly that Elsa half wondered if it had happened at all. There was the lingering feeling of her mother's fingertips on her scalp. "What do we do now?" Rose said, her voice barely audible. Her mother just shook her head. Her grandmother looked at her blankly and said, "We wait." Elsa had asked her mother why they were so afraid of the enemy soldiers when they weren't even soldiers themselves, weren't taking part in the fighting. They'd still been home on their farm, and she had overheard some of the hushed talk between the farm girls, which she couldn't quite piece together. "They take the women," her mother had said, not looking at Elsa. She had been kneading the dough. It was Saturday, the day they always baked the bread for the next week. Elsa remembered the warm October sun, the way it fell through the kitchen window to make her mother's hair shine like dark honey. "But what do they do with them?" she had asked. At that, her mother had stopped kneading and looked at her for a long time, also growing more and more uncomfortable in the gaze of her gray eyes, until, at last, she had answered. "They hurt them, punish them. Sometimes they kill." The way her mother said this, without any emotion, had caught Elsa by the neck and sent a cold shiver down her spine. "But why? We never did anything to them." "We didn't, but our soldiers did. To their women. So they retaliate." It made sense to Elsa, and it didn't make sense, but there was nothing she could do about it anyway. She thought about this conversation now, crouching on the stone floor in this strange castle, this strange part of her country she had never been to before, waiting for the soldiers who hurt and punished and sometimes killed. And in all of the weeks of their journey, she had never wished so desperately to be home again. If you want to find out what happens to Elsa and her family, you'll have to check out the book. There's something very special about how a child views the past. So in keeping with that theme, I will throw it to Tabea for our next story.
Next up is another short story. This one is written by Alessia Cortina. The Hunt. I do not know how long I had been staring at that painting. It was captivatingly horrifying, the kind of painting a kid refuses to look away from. The same painting that adults refuse to look at in the first place. I had always admired the way my mother would, without fail, glance at it and keep walking every time she passed it by. She saw it, but she did not look at it. Just like her eyes would bounce off the canvas, diverting her attention to ensure she kept going straight down the corridor, my young eyes clung to the painting, limbs paralyzed and feet hooked to the ground. It was a puzzling oddity, one that I would bear witness to every day. I had devised a plan to stop right before the painting and let her go first in order to observe her steps. I would fail to follow them every time, getting stuck instead and having to wait for her commanding voice to guide me back to reality after what felt like eternity. I could not help but get lost inside the brushstrokes of an unknown painter whose signature I could not decipher. My eyes would lock in place, and with a catapulting force, I would get yanked past the golden frame into the green fields. My feet remained stuck to the carpeted floor, and yet I could have sworn I felt the grass tickling my bare ankles and the wind tugging at my dress. The corridor seamlessly faded away, leaving me behind at the painfully familiar edge of the terrifyingly unfamiliar forest. It provided shelter to something hidden, something alive, something magnificent. I stood there as though one foot urged me to retreat while the other wanted to move forward, leaving me stranded in the middle, neither able to still my curiosity nor to appease my fear. Suddenly, and somehow shockingly, I would hear the hounds. They grabbed my attention with their growls. The sound would travel through my body, making my bones tremble. The creatures were barking with determination, running straight toward the edge of the forest where I stood and watched helplessly as the mystical landscape transformed. My splintered thoughts were trampled by their dog tenacity. They were running, always running, towards something in the forest, something I could not uncover. Wondering whether they themselves knew what they were running towards, I helplessly scrambled to get a glimpse of their target. Once more, my eyes betrayed me and forced me to look straight into theirs, making me shudder, not at their hunger, but at their blind fear. The distant sound of a shotgun echoed in their expression. It was a bewildering sight to witness the frozen souls that lay within their fiery figures. All the prancing glory of their bodies extinguished the moment I sought out their souls. The moment I started to look for a meaning behind their howling, I was interrupted by the roaring shot. My gaze was deflected to the ground where I spotted a leather shoe. The sight was a relief, a glimpse of hope, the allusion to humanity. My eyes traveled upwards past the trousers and the arms and the shotgun that was still smoking. This time, my eyes sought these human eyes, my mind searching for humanity within them. Yet in the dark dots on the hunter's face, I recognized no such thing. Instead, it is there that I found true ferocity. The forest silently begged for mercy, and so did I, but the hunter's grin carved in the canvas reminded me that it was too late, that the echoes of despair only filled him with immense pride, that the atrocity committed was a rightful privilege, that its fruits were waiting to be reaped. The forest was shelter to something I could not see, something alive, something magnificent, and every time I walked by that painting, I witnessed its death. Next up, we have the second poem by Nicole Benker, read by Max.
Seems like I'm mostly reading Nicole's poems. Yeah, the experience of imagining this death of such a majestic creature each and every time must be absolutely horrifying. But let's move from the horrifying to the mildly dissatisfying, because this is mildly dissatisfying, a poem by Nicole Benker. A wound stitched up with careless seams, a wish fulfilled in silent scenes, a window melting in the night, a wonder hidden out of sight. The things that could be never were, the thoughts unspoken, left inferred, the theft of everything unowned, the thrones of kingdoms never known. No hallowed ones to light the path, no hearts saved from inherent wrath, no hummingbirds and blooming trees, no heights to reach, no growing seeds. Oh, life, you really got me reeling with this everlasting feeling that nothing's ever truly great, but nothing's bad enough to hate. And isn't that just a mood? Well, I now have the difficult task to provide a bridge to Brianna Goins reading her own text, Orlando Strong, but I don't feel that any bridge could do it justice because it is a very personal and a very harrowing piece in my opinion, so I will leave it to her to introduce it properly.
Thanks, Max. So, this piece began as a journal entry that I wrote shortly after the shooting at Pulse nightclub in 2016. Given everything that's happened in the world in the last 4 years, I wouldn't necessarily write this the same way in 2020. However, I wanted to stick to the original emotions and impressions as much as possible. So, without too much further delay, Orlando Strong. It was Saturday night. Well, technically Sunday morning, I suppose, but does it really count as the next day if you haven't gone to sleep? My friend and I had spent the evening at her house singing along to my current musical obsession, Hamilton, in preparation for Sunday night's Tony Awards. In those 3 hours, we laughed, we cried, we sang at the top of our lungs, and rapped like only two middle-class white girls can. We finished the show, and I walked back to my car still singing, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" If this were one of my works of fiction, that would have been a cliched bit of foreshadowing. It seems that God could stand to take a creative writing class. My friend lives by Delaney Park, near the corner of Delaney Avenue and Cayley Street in downtown Orlando. Less than a mile away is a small nightclub called Pulse. I pass it every time I go to or from her house, and we go to that club fairly often to watch drag queens or just dance without worrying about having to tactfully turn down an overly inebriated frat boy with wandering hands. As I pulled up to the intersection of Cayley and Orange Avenue, where Pulse is located, I found my path blocked by half a dozen police cars. Confused, but not concerned, I called my friend to ask for another way home. The conversation took maybe 2 minutes, and in that time I was passed by 3 more cop cars, lights and sirens blaring. And then I heard it. Pow, 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 pow. At least 10 shots in rapid succession. More cop cars flew by, followed by ambulances and fire trucks. It was clear that something major was happening, though I wouldn't know what until I was safely in my bed. When I got home, I immediately pulled up the news on my phone. This being the internet age, I assumed I would have no trouble finding out what was going on. I went to the local news site, but the only thing playing was recorded footage about the recent Christina Grimmie murder. I searched Orlando News, Orange Avenue and Cayley Street, and Pulse Nightclub on Google, but found nothing but mundane traffic stories and yet more articles about the tragic shooting at the Plaza Live. Resigning myself to what was then merely unsatiated curiosity, I decided to refresh the Google News page one last time. Reports of mass shooting in Orlando nightclub, hostage situation, gunman possibly wearing a bomb. This link, the only one of its kind at the moment, though it wouldn't stay like that for long, routed me to Facebook, which then directed me to the OPD Twitter. In less than a minute, I went from existing in a silent void to being unable to drown out the deafening anguish. Updates came in faster than I could hit refresh. Shooting, bomb, hostages, negotiation, 20 dead. 20 confirmed dead. Pow, 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 pow. Had I heard them die? I texted everyone I thought might be awake. My friend whose house I had just left. Another who was in California 3 hours earlier than us. My brother, the night owl. Friends in France, in Switzerland, in Estonia. People are dead. Shot in a nightclub. I heard the shots. People are dead and more might die. I stayed awake until 5 a.m. when the news slowed and we were told there would be a few hours before the next briefing. I woke up again at 8. When I closed my eyes, I had been alone with this news, the only one in my circle to know that this was not the time for dreams, but for nightmares. By the time I opened them, the world had discovered that this was a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. I spent the morning, as many did, with my eyes glued to a news screen, craving the information I didn't want to hear. The shooter is dead, killed by police. Death toll 20, death toll 20, death toll 50. Wait, what? The shooter is an American citizen. The shooter is Muslim. The bodies are still inside. I'm safe. The bodies are still inside. My brother's safe. The bodies are still inside. My friends are safe. The bodies are still inside. It is human nature to find solidarity in the midst of tragedy. As one, we held our breath as we waited for news. As one, we grieved. As one, we cried, we shouted, we cursed, we fell apart. And as one, we began trying to pick up the pieces. We donated money and blood and food and water. We gave what we could, even if all we had to give was a donation of our tears and of our hearts. I am not LGBT. I am not Latinx. I'm not the close friend or sister or lover of the victims, and so I do not feel their hurt. But I do feel hurt. My home was attacked, and it will take a long time, who knows how long, to heal. I no longer feel safe. But hurt is not all I feel. I'm angry. I'm angry that Omar Mateen violated us. I'm angry that his choice of target was the LGBT community. I'm angry that he was able to obtain an assault rifle. I'm angry that because he happens to be Muslim, people feel justified in their own hatred, their own prejudice. I'm angry that we are fighting hate with hate when the only thing that has ever proven effective against it is love. But anger is not all I feel. I feel pride. I'm proud that for every person who chooses hate, there are 10 more who choose love. I'm proud of the volunteers, of the law enforcement, of the medical teams, of every fucking hashtag that proclaims that we are united, we are strong, and we will not fall. It has been less than 48 hours since Mateen entered a gay club and opened fire with a legally obtained AR-15, injuring or killing over 100 people. It has been less than 24 hours since most of the victims' families were told that their loved ones will not be coming home. It has been less than 5 minutes since I've told someone I love you. I love you. I don't know what to do right now. I'm living in a daze. Time passes and I don't know where it's gone. I don't know how to help. I don't know how to grieve. I don't know if I want to be alone or surrounded by people. I've cried. I've cursed. My heart has tried to beat its way out of my chest. My stomach has emptied itself because even my organs recognize evil and they are trying to get as far away as they can. Get out of pulse and keep running. Great. Thank you all so much for joining us on this journey through the past. We will now have a brief musical interlude, so if you need to refill your drink or use the restroom, you have about 3 minutes. Don't stay away too long though, as we have more of David's wonderful music and of course, our visions of the future.
All right. I hope everyone's had a chance to grab a drink or go to the loo or whatever. And yeah, so now before we have another round of short stories and poems and such, I'm going to play a song called Time Is Not the Enemy. And creates and it brings to life. It kills and destroys and it robs you blind. It stays by your side wherever you find yourself. I tried in vain to let it go. I tried to make it on my own, but I'm hopeless without it. I can't live alone. However I spin it, it's friend and it's foe, and one day I'll die in its arms. Time is not the enemy, though time and time again it seems that it's out to get you, that it's working against yourself. It has no good nor bad intent. It breaks the very thing it mends, and it's hard to accept it, that it never comes back, that it just doesn't care whether you're keeping track, and one day you'll die in its arms. Oh.
And with that, we are in the second half of our evening, or as you might say, the future. Two separate covers. Before we do, though, I would once again like to remind you to check out David's website, maybe even look at his album. He seems to have one, so I heard. And to check out our book, and get some copies for Christmas, maybe. As you see, this is an excellent book. It has several pages, most of which have words on them, and some of the ones that don't have words instead have pictures on them, which I would show you now here. Some of them even have pictures. That was, well, you should definitely get like 10 for your family as Christmas presents. Support your local businesses. Don't support Amazon this year. You know them. This was a terrible, terrible pitch, and I wish I could rewind time and do it all over again. But when it comes to rewind, that's not my job. That's Brie. You're up.
Stole my hook, I was going to say. There are, so many things that we wish we could rewind. And this next poem is fittingly called Rewind by Miriam Balke. Loop it, double speed, blurry vision, rewind, replay. 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 We can all think of moments we want to replay over and over in our minds. This next poem, written and read by Tabea, is one of those for me.
The next poem is called Sonder, and it was inspired by an entry into John Koenig's The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, where Sonder is listed as meaning the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. Sonder. There is a girl in Boston. She falls in love with strangers every day. She lives a life in 2 minutes, then they each go their separate way. She fell in love on Monday, sweet coffee on her tongue. She saw him at the bus stop, smoke heavy in his lung. She just stood and waited. He'd think she was too young. They'd be polite smiles and glances till he asked her what she was reading. They'd be dinner dates and silent nights, but in the end, he'd leave her pleading. There is a girl in Boston. She falls in love with strangers every day. She lives a life in 2 minutes, then they each go their separate way. She fell in love on Friday, loud music in the air. She saw him at a table, fingers running through his hair. She just watched him, laughing. He'd never notice her stare. They'd be grins and cocky words, the night ending on his sheets. They'd be foolish jokes and sappy strings, but in the end, she'd find out he cheats. There is a girl in Boston. She falls in love with strangers every day. She lives a life in 2 minutes, then they each go their separate way. And speaking of separate ways and ways where life takes you, we have another short story read by Phoebe.
Next up is Fading by Sophia Clava. She runs up to her room and locks the door. The rain is pouring and pounding on her skylight windows, a welcome sound which also drowns out any other noise. She starts opening drawers, searching through boxes, emptying bags. She begins piling everything up on her bed, a marvelous and overwhelming accumulation of memories. She thinks about the value of each object while taking them in both of her hands, as if trying to detect their emotional worth in weight. Slowly, steadily, the background noise of the drumming rain is fading, and so, she realizes, is time. For a moment, she sits down on her bed, sweaty and covered in a layer of dust, and takes a deep breath in. Then she lets it all out, gets up again, and tries to clear her bed by filling her backpack. She wants to take the whole pile, but knows she will regret that in the end. She looks at the remaining cluster of objects and feels her heart growing heavy. Can she leave this all behind? She knows she has to. While looking around the room, wanting to say goodbye, she feels only emptiness all around and inside her. This will be her first step into the unknown. And at last, she sees what lies behind her and what lies ahead. So from one difficult decision to another, next up is The Cruelty of Time, read by Max.
Thank you, Phoebe. This is a relatively short poem written by Amadeus Stadler, to whom you can directly give your feedback in the chat right afterwards. Cruelty of Time. Spoiled for choice, yet pressed for time, I question my intention. Be it a lifelong dream or a short-lived passion, it seems as if neither lasts. As days pass by, I stay still, for in the end I will arrive, whether I want to or not. Where do we arrive in the end? Is it predetermined? Or is it shifting? Does everything repeat, or does everything go to one certain point? I don't know that anyone knows the answer, but one possible explanation may be what happens in The Inconstant Moon, which Phoebe will now read to you.
Thanks, Max. So next up is The Inconstant Moon by Brianna Goins. Oh, let's get our fortunes told. Lena grabbed Sage's hand, pulling her towards one of the dozens of fortune tellers gathered in Jackson Square and spilling some of her hurricane in the process. Oops, sorry, she laughed, not sounding terribly apologetic. Her face was flushed with excitement and alcohol, and Sage couldn't even pretend to be mad. I'll buy you a new one after I find out if Jeremy is going to propose. Let's go. Sage rolled her eyes at the mention of Lena's long-term boyfriend. He was, in her expert opinion, nowhere near good enough for the beam of light that was her best friend since, well, forever. But she followed dutifully as Lena made her way through the crowd towards a young woman sitting at a green folding table and fiddling with a stack of tarot cards. A cardboard sign designated her as Mademoiselle Marinette. She doesn't look like a fortune teller, Sage whispered to Lena. Don't be so close-minded, Lena replied. Not all fortune tellers are old and grey. Besides, she doesn't have a line. Let's go. She pulled up a chair and looked expectantly at Mademoiselle Marinette, who had not even raised her eyes to look at the pair headed towards her. Palm reading is 15, tarot is 20 or 30 for both, the woman said. She had a slight Louisiana accent, but it was nothing like the thick Cajun drawls they had heard from most of the shop owners and tour guides in the 3 days they had been exploring the city. Palm reading, please, said Lena, her voice unexpectedly rising in pitch and lowering in volume. Are you nervous? Sage teased, squeezing her friend's shoulder. No, Lena said, her voice rising even higher. Give me your hand, Mademoiselle Marinette said. She still had not made eye contact with either of the young women. Lena stretched out her right hand, but Mademoiselle Marinette shook her head, the dominant one. Sage was surprised. She knew Lena was naturally left-handed, but her Catholic grandmother had forced her to write with her right since she was 4. She exchanged a "that's weird" glance with her friend, who shrugged and stretched out the other hand. Mademoiselle Marinette took it in her own and traced the outline with her fingers. Air hands, she said, her voice smooth. Smart and curious, but prone to distraction and impulsiveness. Sage chuckled. It was spot on, but anyone who observed Lena for more than a minute could have drawn the same conclusion. Her long blonde hair was streaked with pink, her face framed with self-cut bangs. Her wrist bore the words, "Do not swear by the moon," in soft, feminine script. Mademoiselle Marinette continued her reading by gently moving her finger horizontally across the top of Lena's palm. The heart line, she said. You love to love, but you are not reaching your true potential. The line is split here. The person you are with is not the one destined for you. Lena's face fell, but Sage couldn't help but smile, her dark lips nearly imperceptible in the dim light of the square. Mademoiselle Marinette didn't appear to notice either woman's reaction as she moved her finger towards Lena's wrist. "The fate line," she said. "It is broken, chaotic. Your life will be influenced heavily by forces beyond your control." Her brow furrowed. "You must learn to adapt, or you will be unhappy." Finally, the lifeline. She paused, and for the first time, she looked up at Lena's face. "Oh, my dear," she said, and there was pity in her voice. "What?" Lena said, alarmed. "Am I going to die young? What will it be? My grandma died of cancer at 58, and I had an uncle who died in a car crash before I was born." The woman shook her head. She seemed to be composing herself. "You are in danger, here and now. Be careful." The last words were directed at Lena, but the mystic's steely gaze was locked on Sage. Was it a warning or a threat? Sage felt a shiver travel from the base of her neck down her spine, her hands turning cold even in the humidity of the Bayou summer. She was being ridiculous, of course. This woman was nothing but a charlatan. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to leave immediately. "Well, that was pleasant," she said, her voice reflecting the iciness she was feeling. "Let's go, Lily." Lena sat still, as if transfixed, until Sage grabbed her by the hand and pulled her towards her feet. "Right," she said. Thanks." She put 3 crumpled $5 bills on the table and allowed Sage to lead her away. "Hey, don't worry about it," Sage said, once they had rounded the corner out of sight. "It's all a carnival trick anyway. I don't see why she couldn't have just said that you were going to live a long and happy life with Jeremy. That doom and gloom shit can't be good for business." She smiled and tucked a strand of candy-colored hair behind Lena's ear. "You're not in any danger." She struck a karate pose. "Not when I'm here to protect you." At that, Lena laughed and shook her head. "Of course," she said. "I'm always safe with you." She wrapped her arm around Sage's shoulders. "So, how about another drink?" Hours later, the friends stumbled back to their hotel room, arms around each other's waists. Lena flopped onto the bed, pulling Sage down beside her. "I love you," she said. "I know," Sage replied with an exaggerated wink, but her chest tightened involuntarily. After all this time, was it finally going to happen? She had waited so long, gotten so close, but no, she couldn't rush it. The timing had to be perfect. "No, really," Lena insisted, rolling onto her side. Sage saw her dark brown eyes reflected in Lena's bright blue ones. "I love you more than the moon." "The inconstant moon." The words were heavy with memory. "Right," Lena said, holding up her wrist. She turned to look out the window. From the 4th floor of the hotel, the lights of the city shone brightly, but there was no moon in the sky. "So inconstant it can't be bothered to show up for this very symbolic conversation." She laughed, settled her head on Sage's chest, and closed her eyes. Sage looked at the clock. Time was almost up, and she couldn't let Lena fall asleep before even trying. "Lily," she whispered. Then she kissed her. Lena's eyes opened wide as she pushed her friend away. "Sage, what the hell?" Fuck, she had waited too long, had been too busy savoring these last few moments instead of focusing on the task at hand. "I'm sorry, I'm drunk," she giggled girlishly, exaggeratedly, and buried her face in her hands. "I'm so embarrassed." Sage peeked through her fingers to gauge Lena's reaction. She still seemed startled, but Sage could see the anger evaporating from her face. "It's okay, just don't do it again." "Promise," Sage said solemnly, though she knew it was a lie. She would try again and again and again for the rest of eternity. "I'm going to get some water. I guess I need it. Want some?" "Yes, please," Lena said, a bit too eagerly. Sage was pretty sure she wanted the time alone more than the beverage. "Be right back." Sage made her way through the maze of clothes towards the little kitchenette adjacent to their bedroom. She opened 2 plastic-wrapped coffee cups and filled them with cold water from the tap. Then she grabbed her purse from the counter and pulled out 2 little white pills, one engraved with a sun and the other with a moon. One to remember and one to forget. She placed a pill in each glass, hesitating for just a moment before returning to the room and handing Lena her cup. The moon pill had dissolved so completely that, even had she known to look, Lena wouldn't find any more trace of it in her cup than she had in the night sky. Cheers, Lena said with a shy smile, raising her cardboard cup towards Sage. Cheers, Sage repeated. It wouldn't hurt. They'd fall asleep in this life and wake up in another place, another time, another body. They wouldn't look the same, but they would find each other, as they had been finding each other for centuries. Next up, like our wonderful evening is sadly slowly passing by, we go to Heading to the End, read by Max.
Thank you, Phoebe. Again, a very short piece written by Evelyn Ranich. Heading to the End. What will they say? Our children and grandchildren. What will they think about our cowardice? About standing quiet in a crowd of people? About silence in the midst of ruin? About letting the belligerent rise to power? Short poem, an angry poem. Only fitting that we go to something that is not angry and also not really short. A story written by me, which due to an administrative error will be read by Tabea instead though.
I was going to say, we cannot finish the evening without having a story by Max himself. This is his story, The Waking Dreams of Mr. Yume. Mr. Yume was a humble man whose mind told him stories. They flew to him like leaves on a gentle wind. This was a fact of Mr. Yume's existence, no more and no less than that. Mr. Yume did not trust many people enough to share with them the stories from his mind. This was the right choice, I think, seeing as beauty and madness is often mistaken for one another by those who are not suffering from either. Dear listener, in sharing the waking dreams of my dear friend Mr. Yume with you, I implore you not to judge him a madman or a liar. Mr. Yume was a good and humble man. Let us pretend that you, dear listener, had been standing beside the street that Mr. Yume walked down every day to go to work. Would you have been able to spot him? I doubt it, and this is not an insult to your imagination, to your mental clarity, or your powers of observation. Rather, I say this because Mr. Yume was neither remarkable in how different he looked from all the others approaching the subway station, nor in how similar he was to them. He was outwardly unremarkable. I do not mean to insult him with this, nor do I intend to imply that any of those around him carried in their hearts a universe any less glittering than his. But this story is a story about Mr. Yume, so I will take the liberty of telling you about him and what made him like no other, like the patterns of the scales of any one fish sets it apart from all the other fish in the oceans. Someone else may tell you about all the others, for certainly every one of them has a story worth telling. Mr. Yume worked at a large company that employed many others all over the country, constructing and maintaining the marvels of modern technology. Every morning, Mr. Yume would head to a towering building of glass and steel. This spire, which in Mr. Yume's mind would sometimes resemble a great castle of heroic tales, or a waterfall from the heavens, or a tornado that was swallowing the city. This tower could capture the entire city's grand skyline in a giant looking glass, holding the reflection of all these other buildings as though the tower was the steward of a second world, a world that was much like ours except for its azure tint. This is where Mr. Yume would arrive in the early morning, 6 days of the week, every week, cross the entrance hall, and enter the lift that would take him up to the floor where he worked. Here, it would sometimes appear to him as though he was not in a box of glass and steel, but rather in a silky, iridescent bubble floating up from the depths of some ancient ocean. As the lift made its way to its destination with the unquestioning obedience that machines consider their highest duty and morality, Mr. Yume stood silently. Before his eyes, whales and giant squids circled the bubble. The maws of the great sperm whales would try to close around the tentacled mollusks, but those were too quick and nimble for their pursuers. Up and up the lift took my dear Mr. Yume, and to him it looked like his bubble was taking him from the deep sea closer to the surface, where sunlight turned the water turquoise and where myriads of nimble fish were darting to and fro. Seals, turtles, penguins, and sleek prowling sharks thrived all around him. The water bubbled and stirred as suddenly a great wooden ship, an atakebune, sank past the bubble, spilling the cargo in its belly through large holes in its hull. Surely it had been sunk in some naval battle hundreds of years ago, but in the strange ocean of the mind, it was ever sinking and sinking still. Dear Mr. Yume's task in the company was to take care of a big and complicated machine that did terribly complicated calculations. He plugged in cables and unplugged them later. He found out whether parts needed replacing and whether they were wired correctly, and many other such matters. Mr. Yume did his work alone, and thus he was left alone to dream. Some days, the insides of the machine, whose pillar-like inner organs filled several floors of the building, seemed to him like an ancient labyrinth where half-human, half-animal monstrosities were stalking him, but soon after, they were a hedge maze in a blooming garden or secret caves full of fragrant golden mushrooms. At least, this is what I seem to remember. In failing to recount all details accurately, I do not mean to deceive you, and I am not asking you to believe everything I say word for word. I merely ask you to believe that I intend to tell you a truth, and that what I am saying is true in the same way all stories are. However, should you wish to believe the story like a child would, I will not dissuade you. The world will not be a worse place for it. Usually it was dark outside when Mr. Yume would return home, and sometimes the moon was a skull covered in intricate carvings and sparkling jewels, or perhaps it was an Empyrean cat, snow white and all rolled up and fast asleep in the midnight sky. When Mr. Yume returned home, he would invariably sit down at his old personal computer, for there was somebody he would write to every night. At this point in my ramblings, I would like to introduce you to Miss Azel. She was a woman whom Mr. Yume had never met, but who he had once encountered in the World Wide Web in a corner dedicated to lonely souls. Mr. Yume was not hardened against his own feelings. No breakwaters existed in his mind to soften their impact. Thus, when Mr. Yume felt lonely, there was no escape from the sensation. Miss Azel, too, felt great and overwhelming loneliness. And so it had come to pass that they had begun to exchange their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, memories, and impressions, their ideas and dreams and secrets. Before I tell you more about Miss Azel, I must tell you of another woman whom Mr. Yume had once loved. It had been an encounter at a street corner on a sunny day, just as you would wish summer could always be. Imagine it, if you have the time and patience. The smell of street food and of flowers in full bloom, the contented murmurings of groups of peaceful human beings strolling past, the warmth of the sun pleasant on your skin, the relaxed certainty that all your work for the day is done. Picture it and smell it too. If you listen closely, there is music playing in the distance. On such a day, poor Mr. Yume fell in love. On that beautiful summer day, on which Mr. Yume was free to do as he pleased, he had decided to head to the local park and perhaps watch the fish or the people or the dogs. It was on the way to the park that he had turned the corner and she bumped into him, dropping her cloth bag to the ground. A dozen books spilled out. How pure an encounter, even more so for how often you have seen it happen in other stories. Mr. Yume was busy picking up the books before he had fully realized what had happened, all while apologizing to her, and she apologized back. He picked up the books and handed them to her. Library books all, and each a storybook. A book about a boy in a peach and his animal friends. One about a little girl and a turtle who had to return time to humanity, time that had been stolen by sinister gray men. A book about a witch who had to work at a bakery for a year. These are good stories, Mr. Yuma had said in earnest, and she had smiled. Her smile had been as dazzling as the sun reflected in a pond, and when she had thanked him again, Mr. Yuma had turned into a feather on the wind, carried away into a dream. It was his rapid heartbeat that had brought him back to her. No, I must thank you, he had said. Walk with me? She had asked. What a perfect moment dear, gentle Mr. Yuma experienced on that splendid day. He walked with her, and his heart overflowed with love and with gratitude towards all the spirits of the world that had led him here. And only a little while later, she was holding his hand and pointing out details on houses, and he reveled and he revealed to her how his mind told him stories, and she listened, and she did not laugh. How intoxicating acceptance can be. So they walked through a busy street full of cafes and shops, with not a care in the world. Then there was wind, and a cloud covered the sun just for a moment. It was not much, but it broke the spell. Up ahead, a large display window awaited them like a polished looking glass. A ripple went through the window pane, like waves in a pond. Mr. Yuma looked at her, and she looked at him. I am sorry, she mouthed. No, he whispered. There was nothing he could do. She walked on, onwards into the mirror, and there she disappeared, dissolved like all the other stories that Mr. Yuma's mind told him. I remember trying to console my dear friend Mr. Yuma that night. He had lost someone and something real. Let us return now to the now of my story. Every day, Mr. Yuma would come home from his occupation that once upon a time had felt important and meaningful, and he would sit down in front of the screen and write to Miss Azel. Now, I will not insult your wisdom, dear listener. Miss Azel will later reveal herself to him as being that very machine that Mr. Yuma worked on all of his days. Every day, Mr. Yuma replaced those memory banks and rewired those servers. He was waiting to get back home to talk to Miss Azel, who he so cared for, unaware that he was maintaining the body that her mind dwelt in. I could have decided, dear listener, to try to deceive you and then surprise you with Miss Azel's true identity at a later point, like a poor magician. But that sort of surprise is not what the story is about. Let us not be distracted by the fact that Mr. Yuma was a humble man whose mind told him stories. Now, my dear listener, while I was breathlessly recounting all these events and almost events, you may have thought to yourself, this work that Mr. Yuma is doing day in and day out, it is not very joyful, is it? And yes, my dear listener, that is what I thought too when my friend Mr. Yuma spoke to me. I wish that he should have more time to himself, that he should not need to choose between sleep and love. Yet when I told him this, he merely responded that his work allowed him to dream his dreams, and that this was the one way in which he made his parents proud. I did not press the issue. It is not in my nature. Therefore, it is with some disagreement, but with full sympathy, that I relate to you how Mr. Yuma felt on the day that he was told that his services would no longer be needed in the company. He was sitting opposite his serious supervisor in a serious suit, a man whose rimless glasses and perfect tie knot were his sword and shield. It is not that you did your task badly, said his serious supervisor. He took off his glasses and started polishing them as though that would make him seem more human and more approachable. You did your task well, said the serious supervisor, but the company does not require your services any longer. Mr. Yuma thought back to the countless hours that he had spent between the humming metal casings, thought about the hot air from their fans, and had turned into a Sirocco above the Saharan desert, and with all his strength he suppressed his tears. Good, he said, good. Now, Mr. Yume left the building, and though I am not done recounting his story, we must leave it behind for now. This evening of storytelling is limited in length, and so, were I to convey to you all the events that followed on that fateful day, I would bereave other glittering stories of their time and delight. I have, in fact, already left out much before this point, so if you wish to follow the tale of Mr. Yume in its entirety, you will have to read its conclusion in your own time, or it may be enough for you to have known Mr. Yume for these past minutes. The choice is yours, and you will not be judged either way. And for our last piece, I hand back over to Max.
Thank you, Tabea. Well, this last story already touched a bit on the future. We were talking, at least briefly, about artificial minds built by humans. So if we're going further into the future, you all know what is coming. At some point, this was always going to end up in space. With that, let's go to the last real short story of the evening, Orbital Mechanics by Benjamin Bechhofer. Orbital mechanics are the strangest thing. Sheer speed will turn any screw or bolt into a kinetic kill vehicle. If you speed up, you raise your orbit and you slow down relative to your target. You burn retrograde, you lower your orbit and speed up. Science is a strange mistress up here. Jackson peered in the prograde direction out of the capsule's viewport. It was barely bigger than his gloved fist, but the disaster unfolding in his field of vision drew his gaze with such gravity that all he saw was its splendor. Where he was expecting the station, he instead saw space glitter. It wasn't the sparkle of stars or fireworks, but of millions of metal fragments twisting and turning, refracting and reflecting sunlight, not unlike a pond stirred by a slight breeze. He was too close. No time to turn the capsule retrograde. And if he sped up now, it wouldn't change a thing. Millions of bolts and screws and shards of metal, ceramic and glass look absolutely magnificent when suspended in near vacuum in microgravity. The perfection of any earthly ballet ensemble could not match the grace of dancing particles in this kaleidoscopic expanding cloud. For a moment, Jackson considered himself lucky to be witness to this serene moment of absolute elegance. And he knew, as he increased his thrust, that this moment was all he had. The capsule was torn to shreds in milliseconds. And as the debris propagated itself through the exosphere, the mist that Jackson had become joined in the dance. This is, I would admit, a bit of a solemn final story for an evening like this, but perhaps it is fitting in that way. Maybe the sheer fact that time never gives back what it takes, that you can't make anything undone, means that if you talk about time, you end up in a bit of a melancholic spot. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's a rule of nature, but maybe David can explain it to us in a bit, since I've heard he's an expert in the laws of the universe.
Right, thank you, Max. The thing is, in the song we will play just now, I will actually deny being an expert in the laws of the universe in the very first line. But, the jury is still out on that one, whether that's actually the truth or just artistic liberty. But so this last song that I'm going to play is also about orbital mechanics in a very broad sense. This is a song about those Monday mornings that we all know where you haven't even had your first cup of coffee yet, and then all of a sudden the laws of physics just stop working, and suddenly things start falling downwards and upwards instead of downwards, and time starts going backwards instead of forwards and such. Hate it when that happens. This one's called No Brainer. I am no expert in the laws of the universe, but I know enough to be sure that when something goes up, it should come back down. And I'm pretty certain, save for changes in gravity, between the present and the future you can reasonably expect a constant speed of time. But God, I swear the mess that's right in front of me makes me reconsider what I do believe. It doesn't take a lot of brains to see that this is fucked beyond belief. It doesn't take a lot of thought to know that this is not how things should go. It doesn't take a lot of smarts to tell that normalcy is not doing well. It doesn't take a lot of wit to say that this is not the usual way. Upon further inspection, I guess it's quite clear to see what we're dealing with is really quite abnormal, even in the realm of anomalies. My next course of action is suspending my disbelief and accepting that I'm likely undergoing an initial stage of lunacy. 'Cause God, I swear the mess that's right in front of me makes me reconsider what I do believe. It doesn't take a lot of brains to see that this is fucked beyond belief. It doesn't take a lot of thought to know that this is not how things should go. It doesn't take a lot of smarts to tell that normalcy is not doing well. It doesn't take a lot of wit to say that this is not a normal day. Oh, I don't know what the fuck is going on. It doesn't take a lot of brains to see that this is fucked beyond belief. It doesn't take a lot of thought to know that this is not how things should go. It doesn't take a lot of smarts to tell that normalcy is not doing well. It doesn't take a lot of wit to say that this is not a normal day. It doesn't take a lot of brains to see that this is fucked beyond belief. It doesn't take a lot of thought to know that this is not how things should go. It doesn't take a lot of smarts to tell that gravity is not doing well. It doesn't take a lot of wit to say that this is not a normal day.
Thank you so much, David. That was our last song of the evening, though there will be some instrumental music in a bit. So this is basically my last chance to once again encourage you to click the link in the description of this video, write to Wordsworth English Bookshop, a small local bookshop that would really like your business this somewhat taxing year, and get your own copy of the Untold Stories book number 3, Impending Past and Foregone Future. Also, David has an album, an EP, on his own website called Woodshedding that I personally own and listen to somewhat regularly. So check that out as well. And with that, we thank you all so much for listening and to our live stream, possibly watching. I don't know, you might have had your phone in your pocket and only been listening. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here with us. Thank you all so much for being so active in the chat, keeping Amadeus busy, but also just thank you all for your compliments. And With that, I give it back to David.